But the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were all written anonymously and almost certainly not by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
I foresee numerous trust me bro statements incoming, and I say it with utmost certainty that every early patristic and historian from the apostolic founded churches would heavily disagree with any word you will utter from this point onward, even with the word the. It is not just the likes of Irenaeus, Jerome, Eusebius, Clement of Alexandria, etc. that I am referring to here. Even them like Papias of Hierapolis, of whom embraced the strangest interpretation of Revelation you could find in early 2nd century Asia Minor, is twisting in his ossuary at some of your guys' claim of gospel anonymity. The consensus that the authors of the gospels are anonymous is not a historical consensus, but a factory new consensus produced by the definitely immune to dogma and cognitive bias skeptic German scholars way later into the Enlightenment era. Johann Herder, for example, where he even classified the Gospels as unsophisticated folk literature, rather than one of the most reliable sources of history. Disproven by onomastic congruence and geographical accuracy, but let's hear it.
None of the Gospels actually explicitly names their authors.
Okay. So we're starting off with the dustiest and most beaten to the ground argument you could ever bring up against the authorship of the Gospels, and you still chose to bloom your argument with it? This argument that the Gospels do not explicitly identify the authors within the main preface is not evidence they circulated as anonymous works pre-Irenaeus of Lyons, and special among bishops and churches. That's just special pleading. Don't take my word on this. Take Simon Gattercoll's, for example, where in the alleged anonymity of the canonical Gospels, Gattercoll points out a lack of claim of authorship internally is entirely irrelevant to the question of the Gospel's anonymity. Anonymity cannot be defined by the lack of reference to a name in the body of the work, and therefore the argument that the Gospels are anonymous because they do not contain the author's name is invalid. And you also have Elmer Herkrumer, who notes that this practice of an author leaving their name out of the body of their work was a common practice. Or Simon Swain in The Hiding Author. He tells us it is perfectly normal for literary works to begin without a reference to the author. Let us take Julius Caesar, where Michael Licona tells us that Julius Caesar did not identify himself as the author of his commentaries on the Civil War, and he writes entirely in third person as the author of John's Gospel may have done. Is it only Julius Caesar we can use as an example? Not at all. Philo didn't mention his name in his biographies of Joseph, Abraham, and Moses. Porphyry does not tell us he is the author of any of his surviving works. Plutarch also doesn't give out his name in parallel lives, and the list goes on and on. Xenophon, Josephus, Tacitus, etc. Because this was an usual practice of Greco-Roman biographies back in antiquity, as this is not about you as much as it is about the character you're writing about. And even if you're in the story, you put yourself in there with a code name or an epithet, or in third person, or in first person plural. But when the Gospels do it, it's all of a sudden an issue that should put to question the authorship. The double standard, huh? As an example, let us take a movie series novel head writer, Vince Gilligan, for the sake of my argument. He was the main author of Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. Nothing to dispute here, right? This is universally accepted even by my children who are not even born yet. Before the pilot episode of Breaking Bad aired, correct me if my recollections have failed me, did he ever start off with, "Hello, this is Vince Gilligan, the main author of Breaking Bad, and I'm presenting you the story of Walter Hartwell White"? No, because again, the narrative isn't about the author as much as it is about the person the author is writing about. That whole introduction is unnecessary, only distracts from the main course, and adds nothing to the dish at large. The outside devices, such as the credits, but in the case of the Gospels, a variety of external devices, are more than enough to identify who wrote what. Aha, you're comparing the Gospels to fiction! Yeah, because I know what the audience and age demographic my content attracts. And the moment I speak outside memes and middle school level comparisons, the wiring up in your domes cuts. The only of the few examples we have, correct me if I'm mistaken, where an author's name is mentioned is in Lucian's The Passing of Peregrinus, where he wrote Lucian to Cronos with best wishes, or in Historia Augusta, written by Elius, which is a late 4th century fiction, and it most likely wasn't written by the author it is attributed to. To Diocletian Augustus, his Aelius Spartianus, greetings. Here's a pet peeve of mine now that I've gotten to Historia Augusta. If Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John named themselves within the body of their works as skeptics so much wish they did, would they be satiated? No! Instead, they would larp onto, but that's what the Gnostic Gospels also do to cultivate credibility. Coincidence? But in our third dimension, the Gospel authors do not plaster their names within the main preface. And what's the problem? The Gospel authors do not mention themselves eternally, therefore they cannot be penned by the authors they have been attributed to for pretty much 2 millennia by differing church fathers in differing continents and differing timelines. I need more evidence. And when I say evidence, I mean special criterias that I do not expect of other ancient works to check, but of the Gospels only. Numerous ancient documents such as the Gospels may have been anonymous internally, but that doesn't mean they would not identify the author in an external fashion, such as in a signature on the back of the scroll and title with a name tag attached, etc. My lighting is so bad, how did I not notice? Or again, in the alleged anonymity of the Gospels, Gathercole goes on to say that absence of a name within the body of an ancient work is entirely understandable because of all the other ways in which the author may be identified. There were, of course, numerous ways of indicating an author's name in or on a roll or codex, outside of the work itself. That's better. According to Pliny the Elder in Book 13 of his Natural Story, papyrus was expensive back in antiquity since it was primarily found in the sluggish waters of the Nile, and besides being mainly used for government administration, legal documents, commercial records, private correspondence, etc., it was also used in the craft of boats, of ropes, of mats, and a multitude of other everyday items of which could have been placed under high demand at times. And to make matters more difficult, during the reign of Tiberius, there was so great a scarcity of paper that members of the Senate were appointed to regulate the distribution of it. Had this not been done, all the ordinary relations of life would have been completely disarranged. There is no concrete evidence the empire experienced a prolonged empire-wide shortage of papyrus during the 1st century that prevented documents from being produced, but according to Pliny the Elder, even these temporary shortages of papyrus could be disruptive enough to require senatorial oversight of its distribution and pricing. These shortages could have affected those outside of the imperial administration first, as government business would have received priority over private and less essential uses. Talking about historians, I'm no historian myself, and I don't shy away from making it clear as day. However, it speaks to me that it was a bum to be an underground scribe, a special one outside of Egypt who had to produce multiple copies of the same document from a poorly resourced church in a period that the empire could also face shortages of papyrus which had the means to manipulate prices and distribution. Therefore, it is not an impossibility someone like Matthew or Luke, along with other scribes closely associated with them who could be lacking easy access to a generous quantity of papyri, would dedicate more than a space at the top or at the bottom of the page for their identification instead of a full external identification. For papyrus scarcity could make authors, consciously or subconsciously, less verbose in identifying themselves. Even if they did not lack papyrus to compose their lengthy works, that doesn't mean these papyrus shortages couldn't have encouraged habits of concision in non-essential features, such as an authorial identification beyond an end title or a signature. Do you seek that Mark wrote a biography of himself? Well, don't seek it in the gospel he wrote, okay? This is like walking down into a Wendy's and being surprised they don't serve whole fresh tomatoes just because their burgers have ketchup between their buns. Please tell me you understood my analogy. In my head, it's Oxford University level. Or perhaps the gospel authors did identify themselves outside of the document, like in a now lost exemplar, and the only shortage happening here is in my IQ points to believe the occasional papyri shortages could have affected the gospel writers on a significant scale, psychologically or economically. But there is no preserved historical or manuscript evidence from any of the early churches to support this hypothesis that the authors identified themselves outside of the roll or codex. The identification they chose in title form was sufficient. I, Mark, wrote this, or I, Matthew, wrote this, is not the sturdiest nail for establishing reliability. That's for the Gnostics of Nag Hammadi. They indulge in this practice, and look at how reliable their books are known to be. Anyone can slap I, John, wrote this on a scroll or codex because that's the highest bar available to a forger. But not everyone holds the reliable chain of custody going back to the apostles or to disciples who knew the apostles, deeming explicit identification worthless. That is why Marcion of Sinope failed in slipping in his own fanfiction of the scriptures, in spite of how influential and financially helpful to the churches in Rome he could have been. The churches didn't just assimilate anything that was to their personal benefit, for if that's what they were after, they lacked intelligence in rejecting Marcion from every church in Asia, Europe, and Africa for centuries onward. The guy jiggled the bag before them, okay? 200,000 sesterces, according to Tertullian. And everyone from Justin Martyr all the way to Augustine of Hippo just chose to deny both his theology and donations altogether. Even one of Polycarp of Smyrna's most infamous quotes is him calling out Marcion as the firstborn of Satan, and for good reasons too. And it wasn't only Marcion who was rejected by the patristics. The early church fathers also dismissed texts such as the Gospel of Peter and other apocryphal works. Why such consistent rejection over centuries? Because these writings could not be credibly traced back to the apostles or to disciples of the apostles, whose testimony was regarded as authority above all. Some of these later texts sure tell more elaborate and more dramatic stories. The Gospel of Peter, for example, depicts the resurrection of Jesus in a grandiose, highly detailed, almost Bollywood level fashion. On the other hand, the Gospel of Mark ends abruptly, with the woman discovering the empty tomb before the risen Jesus is ever seen. The resurrection is the focal point of Christianity. So if the goal had simply been to make Christianity more impressive or persuasive, I don't know, the Gospel of Peter might have seemed a better candidate. But the early church fathers were not looking for fireworks and spectacles. They valued what they believed was authentic apostolic testimony over an anime protagonist comeback of Jesus. In the case of the Gospels, I fall on the belief that it was very likely the authors identified themselves by the proeminent end title before distribution, or perhaps even by a special signature bishops in close relationship with the evangelists could identify and trace back to who the author claims to be. Analogous to Paul's handwritten closing proposing in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 verse 17, which he describes as the distinguishing mark of his letters to ensure authenticity rather than through various other means. And only with the second generation of scribes did the infamous titles come about. While still on the topic of titles, as it can be observed in a few early manuscripts such as P4, P75, and P66, and codices we possess that have preserved the first and or last page of the Gospels, such as Codex Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, it's always Evangelion kata Mattaion, kata Markon, kata Lucan, Evangelion kata Ioannis. There is no differing tradition in identifying who the evangelists are, which goes to show the identification pattern might have had one literary and early place of origin which later scribes copied from generation to generation. It wasn't suddenly revealed in a dream to the scribes of the 2nd century how they should title the Gospels when competing Gospels began appearing. They had the attributions of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John from Irenaeus of Lyons or from a source we somehow only possess in our speculations as per usual. Good. What about the Gospel according to? And according to, it had to originate from pioneering churches and early Christian communities of the 1st century, right? Couldn't originate from all of the hundreds of churches in Syria, Greece, North Africa, Italy, Egypt, and so on at once. By the time we get to the mid to late 2nd century, I'm sorry, it's not just the author names that were already widely established, but the identification pattern as well. It is just the order they were written that the patristics were debating on. If the full attributions only came as late as the 180s, we would see differing title traditions arising from different churches around the Roman Empire, or any manuscript evidence at all, which we never see, believe it or not. It's always the Gospel according to, Evangelion kata, or simply according to, kata, never the recollections of Mark, the memoirs of John, the tales of Luke, etc. Am I claiming that every detail of this reconstruction can be established with certainty? No. Most of the evidence is indirect, speculative, and superficial rather than rooted deep in history. However, the ideas I'm putting forth are closer to the roots, while many of the claims skeptics make barely blow the leaves. There was never a debate about the authorship of the original 4 Gospels, but somehow this new consensus that the Gospels weren't based on eyewitnesses, but were written by unknown Greek authors who somehow had extensive knowledge of 1st century Judea, under unknown guides that were not eyewitnesses or who did not know the eyewitnesses, distributed by a Christian community we don't know the name of, is somehow considered academic and is the most favored view among scholars today. We don't know anything about these Gospels, but we know with utmost certainty they weren't written by the authors they have been attributed to for almost 2,000 years. The dogma here is radiating like Cernobel's elephant foot. Alright, see you in my next video where I will give answer to the second claim. The beloved disciple is not John the Apostle. This is the same as saying Batman is not Bruce Wayne just because he doesn't explicitly state it in every speech bubble of his.